One of the many, many reasons I love Xenosaga is because of its unforgettable characters. The game may be set thousands of years in the distant future, but the characters you encounter are just as real as anyone you meet in this world. From Shion's tumultuous journey coming to terms with her multitudinous traumas, Ziggy's emotional rediscovery of his humanity, to Albedo's tragic core at the center of his insane exterior. I could go on, but you guys have probably already seen my 3-hour retrospective of the series, so I don't need to repeat myself. But if you haven't, you really should. But of all these extraordinary characters, there's one in particular that's refused to leave my mind, one that tends to be passed over in favor of the protagonists. That character is Commander Cherenkov. Now, I understand why some may find this a surprising choice. I mean, this is a guy who's only in the first half of the first episode and is never mentioned again after that point. How can he be that memorable? Well, I've always felt that just because you're not a protagonist doesn't mean your story isn't worth telling. To that end, I want to bring more attention to one of the most unforgettable and heartbreaking narratives in the history of RPGs by doing a deep dive into every scene Cherenkov is featured in. I hope that when I'm done, you'll come to appreciate his story as much as I have for the past 2 decades. We're introduced to Cherenkov early in Episode 1, as the Federation cruiser Woglinde is in the midst of its journey to recover the Zohar emulator. The commander, as is fitting of a high-ranking Federation officer, is aboard the ship's bridge, gazing into the cosmos alongside the ship's executive officer, Captain Moriyama. Now, before we get too deep into the weeds, I want to bring up something that I seldom hear mentioned in Xenosaga discussions: the cinematography. There's no end of discussion of the character designs or the graphical engine, but I don't see the cinematography talked about very much. And I'm just as guilty of this as anyone else. When I made my retrospectives, I think the only time I moved the cinematography to the foreground was when I was tearing apart a couple particularly embarrassing scenes from Episode 2. Hopefully this video is an adequate apology for that oversight, as it was only by hyper-focusing specifically on Cherenkov's scenes for this video that I realized how good the cinematography in this game could get. At the risk of stating the obvious, Tetsuya Takahashi is an absolute master of his craft. We're told almost nothing about Cherenkov in this first scene, but it wasn't necessary, as the cinematography is able to do most of the heavy lifting on its own. To start with the obvious, both him and Moriyama are wearing darker colored uniforms, immediately differentiating them from the green colored uniforms worn by the rest of the bridge crew. When on camera, he's usually framed either by himself or near Moriyama, often from a slight low angle suggesting authority and command. All this serves to hammer home the message that Cherenkov is somehow set apart from the rest of his compatriots on the bridge, but the scene goes farther by driving a wedge between him and Moriyama, the only other person on his level. When Pollyanna, another member of the bridge crew, innocently suggests the asteroid field should be adequate to hide the fleet from enemies, Cherenkov leaves his post atop the captain's platform, walks down to the lower level, and berates the girl for her naivete. I understand I probably sound insane for focusing on something so insignificant, but I genuinely think there's a lot being said here under the surface. Cherenkov spent the first part of the scene next to Moriyama on the captain's platform. His descent from that platform is both literal and metaphorical, as it's the first time he's communicating with those ranked below him, and it doesn't go well at all. Pollyanna can barely get out a response, and it takes Moriyama's intervention to defuse the situation. So what we have here is an elite military officer who is either unwilling or unable, we can't tell which just yet, to communicate with anyone who isn't on his level. This is in stark contrast to Moriyama, who's able to navigate seamlessly among both his underlings and his equals. The rest of the first scene serves to drive home that distinction. Most notably, Cherenkov freaks out his bridge crew by suggesting the protection of the Zohar takes priority over their lives, and once again it's up to Moriyama to ease the tension. One has to wonder what's going on in his head here. I mean, the bridge crew straight up admitted they weren't privy to what the current situation was, and it's obvious that they're all confused and frightened. Cherenkov was standing right there. He heard all of this. Either he's completely oblivious or actively choosing to ignore the signals. This atmosphere of discomfort continues when Shion gives Cherenkov Cosmos' simulation data, and he realizes that Vector hasn't conducted any actual field tests yet. Up until now, though Cherenkov's had trouble communicating with his cohort, he's remained level-headed. Here, that facade crumbles. He explains that the fleet for the mission was assembled in haste, and that Cosmos was supposed to serve as protection. Her not being active blows a huge hole in their defensive capabilities. He's clearly both angry and anxious about the situation, and Shion takes the brunt of his abuse. Cherenkov seems to forget that Shion is a civilian and berates her as he would any grunt soldier under his command. And again, it's Moriyama who tries to defuse the situation, but before Cherenkov has a chance to justify his outburst, he receives what seems like an emergency communique and leaves the bridge in haste. Cherenkov's commandeered an empty communications room, and is in the middle of a conversation with an unidentified man. This is jumping ahead a bit, but the player will shortly learn that the man is Commander Margulis, leader of the UTIC organization and one of Xenosaga's primary antagonists, which makes Cherenkov an enemy in disguise. But even though this isn't revealed just yet, his design does a good enough job saying this without actually saying it. He's clearly wearing some sort of military uniform that's very different in design from that of the Federation. This scene is fascinating, as for the first time we see a side of Cherenkov that's almost diametrically opposed to anything we've seen till now. Margulis scolds Cherenkov for botching the Zohar's retrieval and drawing the Gnosis to the ship. In response, Cherenkov sounds almost like a frightened child, desperate for his father's approval. The cinematography, again, reinforces this moment of weakness. The monitor is framed in such a way that it completely overwhelms the scene, emphasizing how small he is relative to Margulis at this moment. Unfortunately for Cherenkov, Margulis isn't interested in providing any sort of comfort. All he cares about is the success of their mission, which he sees as a foregone conclusion considering the ship has Cosmos on board as protection. This gets the most emotional response out of Cherenkov yet. The thought of Cosmos activating without any sort of field testing seems terrifying to him, almost as if some sort of catastrophe is inevitable if she is indeed to activate. Again, Margulis isn't interested in his concerns. He demands Cherenkov complete the mission as assigned, leaving the frightened commander crying out in vain, his voice almost on the edge of tears. As the scene fades, the audience is left wondering which is the true Cherenkov, the hardened Federation officer or the terrified UTIC underling, and one gets the very real impression that what we've just seen is infinitely closer to the truth. As Margulis predicts, the Gnosis attack the Woglinde. In the chaos, Moriyama wonders where Cherenkov's gone to. The scene immediately cuts to the commander running alone in a spacesuit down the ship's corridor. In his single-minded pursuit of whatever he's running off to, it's obvious that the safety of the bridge crew, the men and women who are ostensibly supposed to be his cohort, is of no concern to him. And indeed, the rest of the bridge is shortly thereafter destroyed, leaving Cherenkov as the sole survivor. As it turns out, the commander was on his way to rendezvous with the other UTIC soldiers who've infiltrated the Woglinde. They're all in the Zohar hangar, attempting to steal the monolith away from the Federation. As Cherenkov joins them, the cinematography again reinforces the idea that he's somehow set apart from the rest. He's generally not in frame with the other three men. It isn't long before we're told directly what it is that sets him apart here. Cherenkov outranks the other men, but is also the only one among them that seems unconcerned with the potential dangers of their mission. Specifically, the others worry about the dangers of traveling through hyperspace unprotected, as well as the potential of a Gnosis ambush. In a particularly apt stroke of directorial genius, the remainder of the scene plays out like a mirror version of the scene with Margulis in the communications room, with Cherenkov himself playing the role of Margulis this time. As was the case with Margulis, he cares only about securing the Zohar, and completely dismisses their worries about the Gnosis, saying they're nothing compared to what would happen if it awakes. We're never told what it is, but context suggests he's talking about Cosmos. This, combined with his fear during the scene with Margulis, makes it clear that he's aware of the overwhelming potential of Cosmos' power, though how this can be is still not yet known. Regardless, the most he's willing to do for his fellow soldiers is to suggest, if the Gnosis find them, to take a drug called Dig-Beta, which will throw them into a near-death state, rendering them invisible to the alien hordes. Cold comfort indeed. In any case, he doesn't care about how they feel about it. As he says, all that matters is the mission, regardless of cost. Indeed, he openly suggests that he's going to die, and this doesn't seem to faze him one bit. His plan hits an unexpected snag when he's unable to free the Zohar from its hangar. The delay leads to a rendezvous with Shion, Alan, Lieutenant Virgil, and Cosmos. Shion seems genuinely surprised to see Cherenkov, and vice versa. Lucky for Cherenkov, the imminent arrival of the Gnosis redirects the group's focus, so he's in no danger of his cover being blown. He looks on at Cosmos, with what seems like a combination of awe and muted terror. That terror isn't misplaced, as we see the android heartlessly shoot and kill Lieutenant Virgil in order to raise her accuracy against the Gnosis by a measly few percentage points. Afterwards, Cosmos makes her way to the Zohar's console. What follows is very telling. As she approaches Cherenkov, he backs away suddenly, totally unable to contain his fear. Cosmos is able to decouple the Zohar from the hangar, which ends up being for naught, as only a few minutes later the Gnosis destroy the Woglinde and steal the monolith for themselves. Thankfully, our heroes are able to secure an escape pod before the ship is lost. Again, what follows is interesting. The escape pods are only able to hold 2 people, and Xion and Alan have claimed both spots. Cosmos, being an android, is able to stand on top of the pod, and Cherenkov is there next to her in his spacesuit. I find this kind of hilarious. The image of this hardened military officer holding onto the escape pod for dear life, it's genuinely funny when you first see it. But at the same time, it forces you to consider the state of mind of someone who's willing to do this. I mean, this is a guy who's so dedicated to completing his mission, to getting in Margulis' good graces, that he's willing to put himself in this horrifyingly dangerous position, next to the one thing he seems most afraid of, no less, to make that happen. After a time, the escape pod is picked up by a freighter called the Elsa. The first scene with the crew aboard the ship is interestingly shot. It focuses so heavily on Xion, Alan, and Cosmos that it's almost as though Cherenkov isn't there. In fact, until rewatching this scene for this video, I genuinely thought he wasn't, but you can, in fact, see him pop up here in the background for a few seconds. We can read a lot into this. Cherenkov may be trying to compose himself after all that's happened, or just trying to keep a low profile so as to not blow his cover. To his credit, he does a good job at that. He asked the Elsa's captain, Matthews, if they could drop him off at Cinear. The game never says what's so important about Cinear, but again, we can use context to discern that it's probably the location of a UTIC base. His request doesn't raise any red flags with Matthews, and it's genuinely refreshing to see that Cherenkov is able to interact civilly with others after all. This relative period of peace doesn't last long, though, as a stray Gnosis infiltrates the Elsa. Cherenkov doesn't hesitate to draw his gun and open fire, which of course does nothing. But one would think that he, of all people, would remember that conventional weapons probably aren't going to do any good against the Gnosis, but it seems that his instincts as a soldier are hardwired into his brain, almost as if they're as natural as breathing. Perhaps because he was the only one to attack, the Gnosis grabs him, and he begins to turn to salt. In response, Chaos walks over and, in an unbelievable display of power, causes the Gnosis to vanish just by touching it. Cherenkov is saved, and the scene ends with the rest of the crew discussing the miracle they just saw, with Cherenkov himself not taking part in the conversation. The Elsa's crew takes a back seat after this scene, with the game focusing on introducing Ziggy and Momo. When we return to the ship, the crew is eating dinner, with Cherenkov being the one notable absence. Xion had apparently called him earlier, so whatever's going on, he's knowingly ignoring her invitation. As it turns out, Cherenkov is holed up in the ship's basement, gazing at Cosmos, who's once again asleep and undergoing routine maintenance. Seeing Cosmos in this state triggers a flashback, and it's here that we can start to piece together the first few tantalizing fragments of what's made the commander the man he is today. On a rainy night, Cherenkov, in his UTIC uniform, meets with an unnamed hooded figure. The man hands him a connection gear, but before we can find out what the connection gear is used for, or even who the hooded man is, he vanishes into thin air. The scene then transitions to a Vector laboratory, as 1st Division prepares for a Cosmos activation test. Without warning, a UTIC raiding party invades the lab, with Cherenkov himself taking up the rear. But once again the game sets him apart from the rest of the UTIC army. Everyone else is armed to the teeth with assault rifles and seems to have no reservations in holding 1st Division hostage. Cherenkov, by distinction, is unarmed and addresses the Vector employees with relative respect. Afterwards, the commander pulls out the connection gear and uses it to activate Cosmos. The pieces are starting to fall in place. We've been told a number of times about a botched activation test 2 years ago that led to the death of Xion's boyfriend Kevin, and this scene basically confirms that this is the activation test in question. Cherenkov himself was responsible for Kevin's death. The scene actually plays out far more disturbingly than we've come to expect, as aside from Kevin, most of the rest of 1st Division is massacred as well, with Cosmos acting almost like a rabid animal. Interspersed between the scenes of brutality are a number of close-ups of Cherenkov's helmet, meant to convey a kind of horror that's unable to be put into words. As if to make the point all the more obvious, the last of these close-ups features his helmet splattered with blood. Cherenkov manages to escape, but not before further witnessing Cosmos destroy an airship and what appears to be an entire city nearby. The flashback ends, and Cherenkov pulls out his gun, prepared to shoot Cosmos in her sleep. But he doesn't. He points the gun at her head, but is unable to pull the trigger. All he can do is stand there, shaking uncontrollably. I tend to wonder what's going on in Cherenkov's head here. Is he still so overwhelmed by Cosmos that he's unable to act? Is he concerned about what destroying Cosmos will do to his cover? We're never told, as before he can do anything, a light turns on, and without thinking he turns the gun towards the door. It's Shion, bringing him dinner. Shion, interestingly enough, doesn't seem that fazed, and when asked why he's looking at Cosmos with a gun in his hand, she totally buys his explanation of it just being a bad habit, because, after all, he's a soldier. That probably says more about her than it does about him. Anyway, Shion stays with Cherenkov as he eats, and surprisingly, Cherenkov seems to try and make small talk with Shion about Cosmos. He even tries to make her feel better about Virgil's death, which had been haunting her since they escaped the Woglinde. His approach is perhaps overly logical, but that just seems to be his personality, and he should be given credit for doing what he can. Shion comments that he eats very neatly, and he responds that's just how he is, at least now, suggesting that at some point he wasn't. Shion doesn't press the point, though, instead asking him what he was doing on the Woglinde, commenting on how he seemed different than the other crew, the first time in the game that a character directly mentions his differences. Cherenkov tells her that the Woglinde fleet was assembled quickly, which is technically true, but we know he's not telling her the whole story. Again, Shion doesn't suspect a thing, but does continue to ponder the true character of this mysterious man who's joined her aboard the Elsa. Afterwards, the focus shifts away from Cherenkov for a while, instead focusing on the arrival of Ziggy and Momo aboard the Elsa, and introducing Junior. When we next see Cherenkov, he places another call to Margulis, informing him that the Zohar was taken by the Gnosis. Once again, his voice is shaky and frightened. Clearly he's dreading Margulis' reaction. He tries to soften the blow by revealing that Momo, who had been taken from UTIC headquarters by Ziggy earlier in the game, is once again secure, by his own hand no less. Margulis is unsympathetic, and the scene ends similarly to how it did on the Woglinde, with Margulis ordering him to stick to his mission and Cherenkov leaving the conversation in distress. It's worth emphasizing that there seems to be two things that can put a crack in Cherenkov's facade: Cosmos and Margulis. The flashbacks to Cosmos' activation made his interactions with her much clearer, but what is it about Margulis that leads to this kind of reaction? Anyway, in the following scene, we learn that Cherenkov has once again skipped dinner and is nowhere to be found. Hammer says he mentioned something about finding a charter flight, which puts the fear of God in Captain Matthews. Apparently, the dock colony they're stationed at is in an area that was basically abandoned during the last major war, and most people living there resent the Federation. Simply put, Cherenkov is in danger, and Shion quickly assembles a team to search for him. Unfortunately for her, Matthews' worst fears come true. When looking for his charter flight, Cherenkov is cornered by a group of punks. We don't see his interaction with the punks, and this is an interesting directorial choice. We already know that Cherenkov is a very capable soldier, and always carries a gun with him. Even if he's outnumbered, he could probably kill every one of those punks without a second thought, but that's not what happens here. The very next scene shows him beaten up in an alleyway, completely cornered. Though we're never told what led to this point, it would appear that Cherenkov must have tried to resolve the situation non-violently. Obviously, his plan ended in complete disaster, with Hammer witnessing the initial blows before running back to find the rest of the Elsa's crew. The punks slowly move in to finish the job, but before they can, a mysterious symbol appears on Cherenkov's head. Shion and the others eventually reach the alleyway thanks to Hammer's guidance, and what they find stuns them. Every single punk is unconscious, bleeding heavily, and hanging onto their life by a thread. While Hammer runs off to call an ambulance, Shion makes the unsettling observation that Cherenkov is nowhere to be found. Ziggy's sensors detect someone moving back towards the Elsa, and concludes that it's probably Cherenkov. The group returns to the basement of the Elsa, where they indeed find Cherenkov with Momo trying to heal his wounds. They walk in just as the commander audibly refuses any more treatment, in a clearly exasperated tone. When asked what's going on, Cherenkov tells them that the punks cornered him, but then started fighting amongst themselves, allowing him to escape. Momo thinks he can't be telling the whole truth, given his adamant refusal to be treated, to which he responds that he's not a fan of nanosurgery. He's clearly acting suspicious here, but nobody else raises any concerns. Momo eventually drops her objections when Ziggy requests she help him with a tune-up, to which she happily agrees. Cherenkov remains with Shion, and the two of them have a conversation, though what exactly they say to each other remains unheard. Ziggy and Momo have their own conversation, the two of them clearly growing closer by the minute. Cherenkov eventually looks over to them and says, "How I envy you," without ever revealing what precisely it is he envies. It may seem that Cherenkov has stabilized, but the next scene directly refutes this. He's in some sort of physical distress, and having multiple flashbacks to both himself and the crew of the Woglinde being attacked by the Gnosis. We aren't sure if it's the after effects of that attack that's causing the distress, but in response, Cherenkov injects himself with some sort of drug, which does cause him to stabilize but also makes that mysterious symbol appear on his forehead again. This discomfort continues through the night, and because of that, the commander is unable to sleep. Visions continue to plague him, but this time, they aren't of the flashbacks of the Gnosis attacks. Though extremely fragmentary, the visions appear to be of Cherenkov himself, running around in panic. We as an audience haven't seen anything like this, so we can only guess what's going on at this point. In an attempt to get a handle on his psyche, Cherenkov goes to the lounge and buys a drink, but as he does, his right arm starts shaking uncontrollably, eventually turning translucent, as if he's becoming a Gnosis himself. He rushes to pull the syringe he used in the previous scene, but in his panic he drops it, and he appears to be too weak to walk over to retrieve it. He slumps against the wall before seeing one last terrifying vision, himself, hanging in the air in an almost crucified pose, as a Zohar glows radiantly behind him. With that disturbing vision over, the scene ends. Shortly afterwards, the Elsa gets swallowed by the colossal Gnosis known as the Cathedral Ship. The crew is separated. The Elsa's bridge crew remain aboard the ship, Xion and her party are 18 kilometers away from the ship, and Cherenkov, as perhaps can be thematically expected at this point, is completely separate, barely able to walk straight. As he traverses the endless corridors, he comes to a shocking realization. The Gnosis is, in fact, the remains of the planet Ariadne. Now, I haven't mentioned Ariadne in this video yet, so for the sake of those watching who may not remember, Ariadne was a planet of 1.5 billion people that vanished without a trace, leaving only the Zohar emulator in its wake. The disappearance seems to be the result of some sort of experiment conducted by the UTIC organization with the Zohar, though at this point in the game the details are hazy. Regardless, judging from Cherenkov's reaction, he obviously has some sort of relationship to the planet, as he begins having a series of visions related to both his and Ariadne's history. Cherenkov finds himself on a walkway, surrounded by a large crowd. In the midst of that crowd, he sees a little girl, and begins walking towards her, but the crowd slowly vanishes, leaving only a mysterious door in its wake. He opens the door slowly, which leads to a war zone. Cherenkov finds himself surrounded by a ruined city littered with corpses, with he himself the only one left alive. Though this first flashback was deliberately opaque, the second one is much clearer, giving the audience the most detailed picture of Cherenkov's past yet. The scene opens in a courtroom, with Cherenkov on trial for some sort of violent crime. His lawyer tells the judges that although his origins are unknown, he's a victim of the former Life Recycling Act, and therefore it would be unfair to subject him to capital punishment, which apparently hasn't been used in millennia. The court agrees with her, sentencing Cherenkov to level 7 personality reconditioning, which should curb his destructive tendencies. As his sentence is read, the symbol appears on his head. This is, in fact, where it comes from. It's a mark of the personality reconditioning, appearing when the neural network is straining to keep the subject under control. Afterwards, we cut to a domestic scene. Apparently, sometime after his trial, Cherenkov and his lawyer married, but the marriage, as we soon discover, is a complete sham. Cherenkov discovers a cloning permit among his wife's possessions, and confronts her about why she needs it, and if they can't just have a child of their own. The wife is disgusted at the thought of having a child with him, and admits she only married him so she could obtain the permit. Cherenkov, by the tone of his voice, seems genuinely upset by the revelations. It would appear that he was none the wiser to his wife's deception, and thought they had an honest-to-goodness loving relationship. His wife laughs off the suggestion, saying she can get more love from her VR headset, which she proceeds to throw at his head. In response, after staring at her in silence, he begins slowly walking in her direction, crushing the VR's headset under his feet. The scene flashes to her laying dead on the floor, before transitioning to Cherenkov in a jail cell. Because the level 7 personality reconditioning procedure failed to control him, Cherenkov has been sentenced to the level 8 procedure. With this sentence comes one of the most terrifying moments in all of Xenosaga. Cherenkov's human rights are revoked, and he's reclassified as a life form belonging to the Federation, with rights equivalent to a Realian. Even his name is erased. No longer is he Cherenkov, but instead solely as Defendant 12584. The scene then switches to a mirror of what we've previously seen, Cherenkov outside in a crowd. He even sees the same little girl, and it's confirmed that it's his ex-wife's clone. Cherenkov approaches the little girl, and stands there silently, seemingly unsure of what to say. After a few seconds, the little girl looks up at him and says a single word: garbage. Cherenkov screams and strangles the girl, killing her instantly. Afterwards, he finds himself in the same jail cell as before. Because the level 8 procedure failed, he's condemned to be a test subject for the level 9 procedure. When next we see Cherenkov, he's outside some sort of facility, surrounded by corpses, with the commander himself curled up in the fetal position, shaking uncontrollably. A Utic airship lands in the facility, and Margulis approaches the shaken commander. Apparently, not only has he murdered everyone in the facility, but 3 entire squads of Federation Special Forces. But, as Margulis aptly observes, Cherenkov himself seems a poor little stray, not a hardened killing machine. Cherenkov doesn't say a word, instead attacking Margulis as if it's the only thing he knows how to do. Margulis is able to use his superhuman reflexes to avoid his attack, and Cherenkov crashes to the floor. Surprisingly, Margulis doesn't retaliate. On the contrary, he decides to take him in. He proves to have an acute psychological insight. He rightly discerns that Cherenkov only wants to leave behind a legacy, and wants to give him the opportunity. This is something Cherenkov probably has been waiting to hear his entire life, and indeed comes to see Margulis as almost his savior. When he looks up at him, a halo of light surrounds his face, almost as if he's more divine being than human. Of course, Cherenkov goes along with Margulis' plan, even though it's entirely possible that Margulis is just taking advantage of Cherenkov at his lowest point. After all, Margulis did admit to one of the other soldiers that, and I quote, "this one may be useful." Honestly, we're never quite sure if Margulis genuinely cares for his new charge, but that's not important. Right now, all that matters is that Cherenkov sees in him the only way to find anything resembling a purpose in life. Cherenkov's final vision takes place sometime later, after he's become fully acclimated to his new life in the Utic organization. He's been placed in charge of the Zohar Link experiment on Ariadne, and it's striking to see how different he seems compared to the previous scene. No longer is he the poor little stray, he's the hardened officer we've known for most of the game. He asks Margulis why he was assigned to the mission, with Margulis telling him that it's a test of loyalty. Margulis seems to suspect that something bad is going to happen, as he admits that regardless of the results, the citizens are going to be affected. Cherenkov doesn't care one bit. Margulis is the only one he cares about at this point, and besides, the citizens think he's garbage anyway. So he completes the test, and takes off before anything serious happens to the planet. As he's flying away, he looks down and sees his ex-wife and her clone looking back at him. Obviously, this can't actually be either of them. What we're likely seeing is a visualization of Cherenkov's past before his point of no return. The fact that he's shocked to see them suggests there's part of him still clinging to the idea of a normal life, even now. Eventually, Shion's party find themselves on the lowest floor of the Zohar containment facility. Cosmos tells her that she's almost certain that this is the same Zohar emulator that was taken from the Woglinde, and that the original Zohar is somewhere else. Shion is dumbfounded at how she could know such a thing, as she wasn't programmed with any of that information. As she says that, Cherenkov emerges from the shadows, mocking her lack of knowledge. The party looks beyond unsettled. They've seen Cherenkov acting strange before, but this appears to be on another level. As he works his way up the ramp, his body once again begins to disappear, and he tells Shion what we now already know, that he was responsible for the Ariadne Disaster, and that he was only aboard the Woglinde to recover the emulator at any cost. In the midst of this sudden act of disclosure, he stops talking, and starts running around the platform as if he's being chased by something. At the end of this breakdown, he floats into the air as the Zohar glows behind him. This is what Cherenkov was witnessing in his nightmares on the Elsa, a vision of his future. Whatever is going on here, the end result is that Cherenkov transforms into an enormous Gnosis. Shion and the others are left with no choice but to take him down. Of course, the party wins. Cherenkov dies, but not without giving Shion access to another vision of his past. The vision in question features Cherenkov and Margulis gazing out the windows of a space cruiser at sunrise over the surface of an unnamed planet. Cherenkov remains silent through the entire scene, listening to Margulis fill his head with what could only be called Utic propaganda. His spiel is mostly pseudo-Nietzschean nonsense, condemning most of the human race to mere sacks of flesh and bone, with, of course, Utic themselves serving as Übermenschen. Though Cherenkov himself doesn't speak, what Xian says when the scene ends is telling. She feels happiness, and deduces that it must be Cherenkov's happiness. This is the only time thus far that Cherenkov has experienced anything approaching happiness, and it's with Margulis, as his seeming co-equal in Utic. After scenes from Cherenkov's life literally flash before our eyes, Xian and the commander find themselves on a beach, filtered entirely in black and white. Cherenkov is sitting down, seemingly in a complete state of calm, and on his own accord, fills in what little of his story remains unknown. Cherenkov, as it turns out, is a biological weapon, created 36 years ago in the midst of a brutal military engagement known only as the Zoar Incident. Soon after his creation, however, the Zoar Incident ended. He tried to fit into a normal life, but he couldn't do it. After all, he literally wasn't created for it. His stints in prison, and the experiences in personality reconditioning, are testaments to his failure to adapt. Margulis was the only person who felt like he needed him, and so he went along with Utic until his dying day. He sums up his life with one melancholic sentence: "The world didn't reject me, I rejected the world." Wherever the two now find themselves, Cherenkov likes it. He's the only thing that exists, and soon he won't even exist either, and that's just what he wants. He says that Xian will one day find herself there too, at which point Xian transports back into the cathedral ship with the rest of her party. Obviously, everyone is profoundly shaken by what just happened. Xian is devastated, Chaos is melancholic, and Ziggy seems to know what's happened but chooses to remain silent. And that's the end of Cherenkov's story. He's literally only mentioned 3 more times after this point. Shortly after his death, a Utic soldier tells Margulis that his tracking signal vanished. Margulis silently closes his eyes, which I take to mean that he really did care for the man after all. After that, Xian briefly flashes back to his transformation after Junior says everyone who contacts the Gnosis turn into one, and Pellegrini mentions him in passing when discussing mentally unstable life recycling variants, in a tone that suggests he feels sorry for his fate. After that, nothing. So, that being the case, what is it about Cherenkov that's resonated with me so strongly? Well, I hope my analysis has done a good enough job convincing you on its own, as I think the power of his story is basically self-evident. But in any case, I want to end the video with a bit of personal reflection. On the surface, Commander Cherenkov doesn't strike one as being particularly sympathetic. After all, he's a high-ranking military officer, he's about as personable as a rabid hyena, and oh yeah, let's not forget that he's murdered more people than we can possibly count. If you take his story literally, then yeah, he's not going to inspire much sympathy. But Xenosaga is a work of art, not a documentary, and as such, taking his story literally is the absolute wrong thing to do. Throughout this video, I took great pains to emphasize how the game seems to go out of its way to frame Cherenkov as somehow set apart from everyone around him. Takahashi's directorial choices seems to clearly emphasize this fact, and what we learn about him throughout the game more than reinforces those choices. Not only is he a double agent, but he's literally set apart from the rest of humanity, being a bioweapon created solely to be used as a weapon of war. It's no surprise that his interactions with the rest of the cast are awkward. He literally was not created for civilian interaction. This has always resonated with me. For so much of my life, I've felt like I'm more like some sort of otherworldly being wearing human skin. It's never been easy for me to connect with others. Not only am I naturally bad at social interaction, but so often do I feel like the things I care most about are so far removed from those of others. There's a line that Cherenkov says during his final conversation with Xian at the beach that's always stuck with me. When he describes his attempts at fitting in with society after the war, he says it's difficult because the language he spoke was so different from the rest of the world. Someone hearing that for the first time might be a bit confused. He speaks English like everyone else in the Xenosaga universe. What the hell is he talking about? Yes, he literally does speak the same language as everybody else, and that's exactly what makes his words so heartbreaking. To feel like your native language is somehow inadequate to express yourself even to other speakers of that language is frightening. How would you be able to form a connection with other people? How could you adequately cry out for help when everyone around you will interpret your cries as nonsense? Again, his struggles hit close to home for me. Whether it's because I can't find the words to adequately describe how I'm feeling, or whether the words just don't connect with who I'm talking to, so often I feel like language isn't a medium that can draw me into a community, but a barrier preventing entrance into that community. If I now consider myself an adequate writer, it's only through the struggle of agonizing over every word, trying as hard as I can to find a suitable phrase for what I want to express. And if I feel more comfortable in writing than I do in speaking, it's because the option to spend as much time as needed to agonize over every word is a luxury that live conversation cannot afford. We see Cherenkov doing the best he can, and in some rare instances, most notably with Shion in the basement of the Elsa, he's able to do alright. But these moments don't last long and are clearly the exceptions to the rule. More often than not, we see him awkwardly stumbling through an interaction, or falling back on barking orders to others, even when that's completely inappropriate to the situation. And these interactions, understandably, never end well. He clearly makes others around him feel uncomfortable, and is often reprimanded for doing so. This should surprise nobody, as, and this bears repeating, Cherenkov was literally made to be a weapon of war. How he functions outside the battlefield was not a factor in his creation. Asking him to live any sort of quote-unquote normal life is just setting him up to fail, and that's not even considering his obvious signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, outside of the fact that he fought during the final stretch of the Zohar incident, we don't really know much of Cherenkov's military history, but because he's essentially a biologically engineered weapon, one can assume it was probably extensive. That first flashback scene on the cathedral ship, where he opens the door to find himself standing in a war zone, is probably meant to embody the lifetime of trauma he's endured. But even if we aren't privy to his entire military history, I feel the game uses abstraction to make the point, specifically in his history with Cosmos. Cherenkov witnessing Cosmos' massacre of Vector's 1st R&D division is, from a narrative standpoint, meant to embody an entire lifetime's worth of trauma in one horrific event. The cinematography of the scene should once again be commended. The repeated flashes to his helmet invokes the idea that the massacre is being deeply impressed into his mind, with the blood splatter at the end a perfect physical representation of that impression. The trauma is so deeply imprinted that he's unable to move past it, constantly replaying it in his mind and causing him to expect it to happen again. This must be a primary cause for both his explosive reaction to Shion on the Wuglinde's bridge, and the terror when he's speaking to Margulis afterwards. The fact that Cosmos hasn't been field tested means that if she wakes up, that terrible night could replay itself again. His reaction to Cosmos in the Zohar hangar, and his rash decision to nearly destroy her in her maintenance bed, suggests that he's running almost entirely on instinct when confronting her after her awakening. Aside from these scenes with Cosmos, one could easily interpret the scenes of Cherenkov having nightmares in his bed after the Gnosis attack as another obvious signs of unresolved post-traumatic stress disorder. So Cherenkov is a man who clearly, in a number of different ways, needs help, and it's beyond tragic that, throughout the entire game, he's never given any. I couldn't help but notice that, during Cherenkov's final monologue when he's talking about his life after the Zohar incident, he fails to mention a single person or organization, aside from Margulis, who I'll talk about in a minute, who tried to help him acclimate to a completely unfamiliar way of life. I tried to adapt, he says, I being the operative word here. It would seem as though the Federation was willing to spend untold resources creating these weapons to fight their wars, but couldn't be bothered to spend a thing to even attempt to transition them to a normal life. With that in mind, him being condemned to personality reconditioning takes on a much more sinister interpretation. Setting aside just how terrifyingly dystopian it is that the Federation apparently has the legal authority to sentence its citizens to something called personality reconditioning, think of the message they're sending here. It's not us who failed you, it's you who failed us, by failing to become a functioning member of society. The judges are even told at his trial that he's a life recycling variant. They can't claim ignorance on this point. But that change is not a thing. The onus is still on Cherenkov to conform to societal expectations, this time with nanotechnology assisting with the process. And surprise, surprise, it's unsuccessful, and yet every time, the Federation never stops to question their sentence, never has the insight to realize that maybe their twisted program of rehabilitation isn't working. It's not our fault. The rules are plainly written for all to see. The bioengineered weapon should have just tried harder. But the most depressing thing about all this is that, given what little we see of the social structure of the Galaxy Federation, there probably would be no hope for Cherenkov if he had continued to try and acclimate himself once again. The scene with his ex-wife's clone is a tragic example of the idea that hate is so often a learned behavior. and it's evident that hatred towards Cherenkov's kind is going to continue to be passed down for at least one more generation. With several lifetimes worth of trauma, a society that cares not one bit about whether he's in an environment where he can thrive, and a language that seems so different from the rest of the world, it's no surprise to me that Cherenkov repeatedly succumbs to physical violence. Martin Luther King memorably described a riot as the language of the unheard, but we can take his insight one step farther. Any act of physical destruction can be considered the language of the unheard, for reasons that should seem obvious. Unlike spoken language, a physical act of destruction doesn't require translation. It doesn't matter that a toddler throwing a temper tantrum isn't yet able to speak. You don't need to hear words to realize that something is wrong. Now, am I endorsing Cherenkov's repeated acts of physical violence? Of course not. Again, his story should not be taken literally, and me saying that he did the right thing by strangling that little girl in the street would be me taking his story literally. The murders are exaggerated by design, meant to embody the logical endpoint in believing that, in a world so mind-bogglingly large and diverse as this one, the only way to succeed is to conform, and any failure to do so should be laid upon us for not doing so. All this considered, I can totally understand why Cherenkov wouldn't want to get close to anyone, whether this means treating his cohort like garbage or straight up ignoring the crew of the Elsa at dinner. He probably resents society at large for failing him time after time, while simultaneously resenting himself for continually causing pain and distress to others. Despite this, he does occasionally try, most notably during his conversation with Shion in the basement of the Elsa, where he attempts to have a normal conversation with her, even doing a surprisingly good job at comforting Shion after Virgil's death. This scene becomes much more powerful once you know his entire history. Though he's literally never been treated well by anyone in his entire life, he's still more than willing to give her the respect he's never received. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, indeed. Why he chooses Shion for this, to me, seems obvious. She's willing to take the time to call him to dinner, she's willing to bring him dinner when he ignores her summons, and she's willing to stay with him while he eats. He must begin to sense, somewhere deep down, that she is someone he can confide in, and starts to take the first small steps towards doing so. This is probably also the reason why Shion, and only Shion, is privy to Cherenkov's final moments on the beach. And yet, despite the genuine progress he seems to be making with Shion, he still attempts to abandon the Elsa without a second thought and get a charter flight, and the reason for this is his undying loyalty to Commander Margulis. Commander Margulis is, without question, the most significant figure in Cherenkov's life. We can debate until the cows come home regarding whether Margulis genuinely cares for Cherenkov or not, but right now the answer isn't important. What matters is that Cherenkov genuinely believes that he does, and is willing to do anything for him in response. He is, from what little we see, utterly receptive to Utik's doctrine, repulsive as it may be. He's willing to put himself in the way of whatever harm is necessary to see Utik succeed, and he's utterly terrified to be perceived as a failure in Margulis' eyes. It should be obvious, at this point, why Cherenkov sounds so afraid whenever he talks to Margulis. He's built him up as this almost larger-than-life figure, a military comrade, a surrogate father, perhaps even a savior. Losing his favor would mean losing the one person in his entire life who's ever given him any sort of purpose, indeed even happiness. As someone who tends to find it difficult to find people to establish any sort of long-term connection with, I can understand where he's coming from. I'm constantly terrified of upsetting the people I care about, and I absolutely hate it when those people are upset with me. One of the worst things I can possibly imagine happening is losing a close friend or family member, because I know that if I were to lose them, they would be so hard, perhaps impossible, to replace. I'm sure that's exactly how Cherenkov feels towards Margulis. The reason why he decides to abandon the Elsa after his conversation with Shion can be explained away by his conversation with Margulis that happened afterwards. Once again, Margulis seemed angry, and Cherenkov couldn't process his anger. Better to leave the Elsa to rendezvous with Margulis directly and try to patch things up than to risk further disappointing him. In the end, Cherenkov does eventually lose Margulis, after transforming into a Gnosis, dying, and appearing on that mysterious beach. He may have lost the closest thing to a friend he's ever had, but that doesn't matter. Since he's the only person who exists there, he no longer has to worry about anyone else hurting him or misunderstanding him. Aside from when he's with Margulis, this is the only other point where he's genuinely happy, as sad as it may seem to us. Though he seems happy, he leaves Shion, and the player, with what I believe to be a despairing summation of his life. The world didn't reject me. I rejected the world. For the longest time, I couldn't understand why he would say such a thing. The world did reject you, I thought. The entire game's been a testament to that. What I didn't realize is that I had inadvertently made the same mistake I had railed against earlier in this video. I took what he was saying literally, and only when I stopped did I realize what was meant here. Every time I fail to live up to social expectations, I blame myself. It doesn't matter the circumstance. It doesn't matter how unfair I'm being. It doesn't matter how unfair or bullshit those social expectations are, the end result is still the same. I've internalized those expectations, and I've subconsciously told myself to live up to that standard, even if consciously I know that that standard is bullshit. Cherenkov is, to his dying breath, doing the exact same thing. Even though his life has been nothing but tragedy and trauma, he's so deeply internalized what he's quote-unquote supposed to be that, because he never made it to that point, he still considers himself a failure. The world didn't reject me, I rejected the world isn't meant to be the moral of his story, it's meant to be the agonizing conclusion from a man who, through no fault of his own, was never able to find lasting peace in the world he was condemned to exist in. I don't like ending my videos on a negative note, but when talking about a story as heart-wrenchingly sad as Cherenkov's, it's hard to avoid that. But I'm gonna try my best, because though his story is sad, that sadness does not necessarily have to lead us to despair. The tone of Cherenkov's narrative, sad as it is, never falls into any sort of tired cynicism, misanthropy, or nihilism. It's beyond apparent that Takahashi and Tanaka care deeply about this man they've created, and were as heartbroken as we are that he had to meet this tragic end. Though he may not be mentioned again after his death, I don't think they would have spent this much time telling his story if they didn't want his audience to take something valuable away from it. And if that was their intention, then they more than succeeded. Cherenkov's story is a call to all of us to create a better world. A world where we support each other in times of crisis or distress. A world where difference isn't an aberration to be corrected, but equality to be celebrated. A world where obvious cries for help are heard and taken seriously. A world where those who seem the most abrasive are recognized as potentially the most vulnerable. Cherenkov may have had to die, but we can honor his memory by doing what we can to ensure that the tragedy of his world is not repeated in ours.